The Sicilian Close, Part 1, by Tim Harding, read by Michael Basman. The close Sicilian is an amorphous system developed initially by the world champion Smyslov and frequently employed by Spassky to exploit his personal strength in middle game play. Its trademark is the development of the white knight at c3, pawns at d3 and e4, and the fianchetto of the white bishop at g2. This is the line we are going to study, and more precisely the positions arising from the sequence of moves 1. Pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, 2. White knight to c3, black knight c6, white pawn to g3, black pawn to g6, white bishop g2, black bishop g7, white pawn to d3, and black pawn to d6, reaching diagram 1. Looking at the position, you can see why it is called close. Not only has white refrained from opening the centre with an early pawn to d4, but the placing of his knight at c3 and pawn at e4 and bishop at g2 mean that black will not find it easy or necessarily advantageous to open the centre himself with pawn to d5. The object of setting up this solid if unambitious central situation is to prepare a kingside attack without fearing a sudden break-up in the centre. Black, with his advanced c-pawn and his fianchettoed bishop looking down towards c3 and b2, will naturally obtain queenside counterplay, but to do this he will have to spend time advancing his queenside pawns. The most black is likely to win by this is a pawn or two, or maybe the exchange, and so long as white is able to seal off the 3 left-hand files where he is defending, his attack on the right-hand side of the board may break through. White's attack, being aimed at the black king, will pay high dividends if it succeeds. There are several advantages for the practical player in choosing the closed Sicilian in preference to the more customary 2 knight to f3. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly for many people, white avoids meeting all those deeply analyzed and dangerous counter-attacking variations of the open Sicilian, like the dragon, or the pelican, or the Najdorf, and the modern sophisticated positional variations like the Khan and the Taimanov as well. As there are comparatively few long theoretical variations in the close Sicilian, the chances of being caught in the trap because one has not read the latest Russian magazine or Guardian chess column is much, much less. Black cannot trot out long strings of grandmaster moves by heart. He will have to think for himself much earlier on. Nor is the close Sicilian a passive opening, although moves like d2 to d3 may give black that impression. It is well suited to aggressive players, because white often wins, as a result of energetic and imaginative kingside play, even when he is positionally outplayed in the early stages. Black has to peel away a lot of layers to obtain play against the white king. Of course, there are disadvantages to the close Sicilian. Usually the white king-bishop plays an essentially defensive role, but what opening variation does not have its problem piece? It's time to look at some illustrative games and underlying ideas. Analyses of the key variations come later. The first game was played on New Year's Day 1972 at Hastings. That's Tim Harding, was white against Jana Hartston. At this time I had recently finished my studies at Oxford, during the latter stages of which I played almost no chess felt I had become out of touch with theory. This was one reason for taking up the bishop's opening, which is 1 e4, e5, 2 bishop c4, which got almost everybody out of the book at once, but no bishop's opening on this occasion. Mrs. Hartston at this time often played the Caro-Kann, so when she met 1 pawn to e4 by 1 pawn to c5, I decided to avoid any lines she might have prepared with her famous husband, and played 2 white knight to c3. If you have your boards set up in this position, we can continue and look at the game. After white's knight to c3, black moved knight to c6. White g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, white pawn to d3, and black pawn to d6. That's diagram 1 we've reached again. Now I chose one of the two main moves in this position, which is 6 bishop to e3. This move is a preparation for exchanging the fianchettoed black king bishop as a prelude to exploiting the holes on the dark squares created by 3 pawn to g6. This plan is not very sophisticated, but in this game my opponent allowed me to carry it out. It is true that, in retrospect, I chose an accurate move order, which avoids lines given in most books. Only Pachmann gives white's 10th move. Well, after 6 white bishop to e3, black moved pawn to e6. White knight to f3, and black knight to d4. Note this maneuver well, since white cannot immediately exchange the piece with knight takes d4, because black pawn takes d4 forks 2 pieces. White therefore left the advanced piece where it was and castled kingside. Black knight to e7, white queen to d2, black castled, and white bishop to h6. And this is diagram 2. If black now plays bishop takes h6, white queen takes h6, black knight takes c2, he loses after knight to g5. If instead of bishop takes h6 from diagram 2, he plays knight takes c2 straight away, he still loses material. In this case, after bishop takes g7, black knight takes a1, and white bishop takes on f8. Therefore, black chose from diagram 2, knight takes f3 check. White bishop takes f3, black bishop takes h6, white queen takes h6, black knight to c6, white bishop retreated to g2, and black knight into d4. This last move, which attacks the c-pawn, encouraged white to defend it with queen to d2, which he did, queen to d2. But now black made an unwise move. Instead of awaiting developments with bishop to d7, she rashly advanced pawn to b5, to which the immediate reply was pawn to e5, opening an attack on the rook at a8. Black blocked this attack with pawn to d5. But in one move, Black's bishop, which was the superior bishop, is now the inferior to the white bishop at g2, just because of a change in the pawn structure. Also, White's pawn at e5 means that the kingside attack will be yet more attractive, reinforced by a knight maneuver to the kingside. This is what occurs. After Black's pawn to d5, White started his transference by moving knight to d1. Black retreated knight to c6, attacking the e-pawn. White played pawn to f4, Black bishop to b7, White knight to f2, Black queen to e7, White knight to g4. It's looking good. Black pawn into d4. Well, Black hasn't defended very well. Probably a couple of moves ago she should have tried pawn to f6, though it would have left Black with weaknesses down the e-file after White exchanges pawns. Now please stop the cassette and work out how White should attack. White played here pawn to f5. Black takes on f5, and now rook takes on f5. Did you find this continuation? Black is quite lost now. If he takes the rook, simply White can play knight to f6 check, king to g7, queen to g5 check, king to h8, and then White queen to h6. And then to stop the mate at h7, Black will have to part with this queen. Well, instead of capturing the rook, Black played knight to d8, which didn't help her much. White moved knight to f6 check, Black king to g7, and now rook to h5. This rook obviously doesn't feel the nails under its feet. In despair, Black captured, pawn takes h5. White moved queen to g5 check, Black king to h8, White queen to h6. Once again there's a threat of mate at h7, and the only way to stop it was for Black to play queen takes f6. But here, rather than capture the queen at f6, White played queen takes f8, which was mate anyway. This is a clean-cut example of White's strategy: development of all the pieces, attack down the E and F files, and a mating finish. Of course, we'll remember that Black's pawn to b5 early on in the game did give White the chance of playing pawn to e5 with a pawn wedge. Had Black played more circumspectly and moved bishop to d7, White would probably have tried to attack by moving the f-pawn down to f5, perhaps supported with pawn to g4. But we'll see examples of that sort of strategy later on. Now let's look at a game on the World Championship level, and this again from the position in diagram 1. So if you'll have that position set up, we can have a look at the game Spassky against Geller from one of their candidate matches, I think in 1968. Now from diagram 1, Spassky did not continue with bishop to e3 as in the last game. He played the other main move, which is pawn to f4. This is the most popular move, which ensures white a kingside space advantage in preparation for his attack on that wing. However, it does renounce the plan we saw in my game against Mrs. Hartston. Now, Spassky is one of the most famous exponents of knight c3, and he's played it in the 1966 World Championship match against Petrosian, and then he played it nearly all the time in his 1968 candidate matches against Geller, and then later against Larsen. And as we know, that was the time when Spassky won the World Championship, finally, against Petrosian in '69. In the last year, Spassky has taken it up again successfully. Before Spassky, Smyslov frequently played the close Sicilian, but in recent years, Smyslov very rarely opens with one pawn to e4. He used to play knight from g1 to e2, as in his World Championship match in 1954 against Botvinnik, and he only took up pawn to f4 as an afterthought, possibly considering it rather too committal. Now, the close Sicilian was known before the war too, but at that time the Sicilian wasn't often played as black, and therefore the need to avoid it, or the need to circumvent the open lines, wasn't apparent. Chilean was one of the first players to work on knight to c3, and then Mises and Tarrasch played it sometimes. One early game with the close Sicilian was Alexander against Botvinnik from Nottingham 1936. It shouldn't be forgotten that Karpov also used to play the close Sicilian. Knight c3 was his regular way of meeting the defence in his early career in junior tournaments and minor internationals. Later on, when he became a very strong player, I imagine his seconds primed him on the more complicated lines of the open Sicilian, and that's what he chooses more often nowadays. Now, a game to illustrate White's kingside attacking plan after 6 pawn to f4. This was the second game of the 1968 Spassky-Geller match. Geller played knight to f6, White knight moved to f3, Black castled, and so did White. Black began his queenside expansion with rook to b8, and White moved knight to h4, preparing to advance further on the king side. Black moved knight to d4. This move, knight to d4, is more direct than the plan chosen by Petrosian 2 years previously, which was to move his bishop to d7. Well, after Black's knight went to d4, White pushed pawn to f5. Black moved pawn to b5, and White bishop to g5. Black pawn to b4. Well, here, surprisingly enough, White didn't move his knight back to e2, which is probably the most sensible move. He in fact moved it to b1. Maybe he was intending later to move it out to d2 and c4, but if he had that intention, he must have changed his mind a little later. After White's knight to b1, Black moved knight to d7. White knight went to d2, and Black knight to to e5. White king went into the corner, so as he would never be checked by the bishop coming to d4, by moving king to h1. And black moved pawn to a5. I'd like you to switch off and study this position for a few minutes. Black appears to have a very nice game. His knights are beautifully placed and he has queenside prospects. Still, Spassky continued nonchalantly with rook to b1, guarding his b-pawn. Black moved pawn to a4, and now white set about removing some of these well-placed central knights. He moved his knight from h4 to f3. Geller accepted the exchange of one of them, playing knight from e5, takes on f3. White recaptured, and black moved his knight away here to b5, still hoping to obtain play on the queen side. White here moved queen to d2, black pawn to a3. White played pawn takes on a3, and black knight takes on a3. So black is making progress on the queen side, whereas at the moment white hasn't been able to do much except play pawn to f5 on the king side. Now, stop the cassette and see if you can decide on what move you should play as white in this position. It's diagram 4. Well, what did you think about this position? Black's knight is attacking the rook, but not only that, he intends to play something like pawn to c4, and perhaps later bishop to a3, with quite a lot of pressure on the queen side. So white's next move wasn't entirely a chivalrous gesture. He moved his rook from b1 to e1, planning, I think, to answer black's pawn c4 by pushing forward himself in the center with pawn to e5. However, as you have no doubt noticed, this rook to e1 does allow black to skewer the queen and the rook by playing bishop to c3, thus winning the exchange. Well, this was not overlooked by Spassky. It was a passive sacrifice. He intended to lure black's bishop from the defense of the black king side with the offer of this exchange, and thus give himself greater attacking chances on the king side. Well, Geller could have declined the offer by moving knight to b5, but then white could move his rook to e2, and then try and advance his kingside pawns, in conjunction with transferring the rook to g2 or h2. White really prefers to swap this rook for the bishop, rather than to play something like bishop to h6, because that bishop, the one on g5, is his most aggressively placed piece, and it could take much longer to make the rook pull its weight. The game anyway now becomes very unclear, as there is no question of a quick checkmate. After white's rook from b1 to e1, in diagram 4, Geller took up the challenge by moving his bishop down to c3. White played queen to f2, black bishop takes e1, white rook takes on e1. Black pawn to f6, white bishop to h6, black rook to f7. Now white begins his kingside pawn advance. Pawn to g4. Black attempted to obtain freedom by moving pawn to e6. White moved knight to h4, with obvious pressure against the pawn on g6. While here black attempted to block the position on the king side by moving pawn to g5. But this is really only a short-term measure because white has got pawn to h4 coming up, and this is going to open the position on the king side for him anyway. So perhaps it was better for black to have played, instead of pawn to g5, pawn from g6 takes on f5, and then play king to h8. You'll notice that black's position, his attack on the queen side, seemed to disappear immediately he gained this material advantage, and now it's white who's having all the say on the king side. Now after black's pawn to g5, Spassky continued with knight to f3. Black played e takes f5, white g takes f5. Black moved king to h8. And now came the breakthrough move, pawn to h4. As it's impossible to defend this pawn on g5, black pushed it on to g4, attempting to use it as a decoy. White's knight moved back to h2, and now black played pawn to g3. This is in effect swapping the c pawn for the g pawn. White took this pawn, queen takes g3, black knight takes c2, attempting to get this piece back into the game. Now white just moved rook to g1, and we can see from this position white has obtained what he was after. All his pieces are on the g and h files, and there's going to be an attack against the black king very soon. Now black attempted to feed some major pieces onto the g file by moving his bishop to b7. In answer to this, white moved bishop to f3. The plan is now just to move the bishop to h5. Of course, if black tries something like queen to g8, then it looks like white can play queen takes on d6. Meanwhile, bishop to f3 has got a very simple threat, which is to move bishop to g7 check. It's also got a secondary threat of moving bishop to h5. Anyway, to stop bishop to g7 check, black moved queen to d7. And white did anyway go bishop to h5. Black rook to e7. And white knight moved in to g4. That attacks the f pawn, of course. This is the position in diagram 5, so please stop the cassette and think again about it. Well, black did have a very attractive defensive move here at his disposal, and this was queen takes on f5, exploiting the pin on the long diagonal. However, white has an immediate crushing move in answer to it. Not such an obvious one, though. He moves knight back to e3, which attacks the queen and the knight on c2, and at the same time it threatens bishop to g7 check. If black in this position plays something like queen takes h5, white could move bishop to g7 check, king to g8, bishop takes on f6 check, and black blocks with queen to g6, and then white will play queen takes on d6, which wins most of black's pieces. Well, back to diagram 5, we'll see that Geller did not play queen takes on f5. So if you'll replace the pieces, we'll see what he in fact did. In diagram 5, Geller played rook to g8, which pins the knight against the queen. White just unpinned in this position queen to f2, gaining a tempo by attacking the knight at c2. Black played knight to d4, and now white finally broke through with knight takes on f6. Rook took on g1 check, queen takes on g1, until Geller resigned. If he tries to stop the mate on g8 by moving his queen back to d8, white can simply move here bishop to e8, and after black plays rook takes bishop, it's once again mate either by bishop to g7 or queen to g7. Well, if these two games give an impression of inevitable white victory, that may be a little misleading. Of course, black could have defended better in both games. Nevertheless, I believe in both cases there was something fundamentally wrong with the plan chosen by black. After 6 pawn to f4, Geller achieved what could be called an optically good position, at least at the stage when he had knights at d4 and e5. But they could not be maintained there. He had to exchange one pair, and if he exchanged the second pair as well, he would not have entirely ruled out Spassky's kingside attacking chances, and would have had less queenside pressure. As it was, his remaining knight spent the critical stage of the game as a helpless observer on a3. Then there was Spassky's exchange sacrifice. The more games with the close Sicilian one sees, the more one gains the impression that black can never afford to exchange his king's bishop for that rook, at least not if he is castled kingside. But in that case, some of his queenside threats are more apparent than real. In one of my games, when my knight had moved from c3 and my bishop was on e3, black played knight from f6 to d7, threatening bishop takes b2. I replied with pawn to b3, and my opponent did not dare play bishop takes rook. It's not enough for black to play his queenside attack to win material. If it is not accompanied by counterplay in the center, white will always get compensation. For white's piece-pawn build-up is so massive that if he plays it half well, sooner or later he will obtain real threats against the black king, which can upset even such a great master as Geller. Black isn't compelled to risk all on his queenside pawn storm. He can try to block white's kingside attack before it really develops. Do you have your pieces back in the starting position? That is, in diagram 1. Now, according to whether white plays 6 bishop to e3, or 6 pawn to f4, or some other move, black should make a decision about what he is going to do with his king's knight, and with his e-pawn. The 2 points are closely connected. If, as in Spassky, black decides to put his knight on f6, his e-pawn is best left on e7, and of course his f-pawn is blocked, and the diagonal of the fianchettoed bishop is blocked. The advantages of black knight to f6 are that the knight can later be maneuvered to d7, or via e8 to c7, and that while it is still on f6, it's quite a good defender of the king. However, it is more popular to develop the knight on e7, often with the view to controlling and even occupying d4 from an early stage. In order to put the knight on e7, it is of course necessary to move the e-pawn first, either to e6 or to e5. This in itself can be a difficult decision for black. Playing the pawn to e6 does keep a fluid pawn structure, but it is rather passive. It does not always prevent white from playing pawn to f4 to f5 in the long run, and in the meantime the queen's bishop scope is reduced. In the Harding-Hartston game, we have already seen e6 failing. In that particular variation, against 6 bishop to e3, black might well have done better by playing 6 pawn to e5, which is also the recommended reply should white play knight from g1 to e2 on move 6. The point of playing black pawn to e5 on move 6 against white's bishop to e3 is to make it hard for white to play pawn from f2 to f4 without risk, because black can play pawn takes pawn and loosen up white's kingside. It's even possible for black to play pawn to e5 in reply to 6 pawn to f4, as we shall see later. These are some of the most critical lines of the closed Sicilian. The most obvious apparent drawback to the move pawn to e5, namely the hole at d5, is not always easy for white to exploit. No, white's chances against pawn to e5 lie more on the f-file, and often, if he is able to play his pawn up to f5 as a sacrifice, he can gain control of squares like h5 or f5. Or where there is a pawn exchange on f4, white might try to use the half-open f-file for his rooks. Black can also try to block white's kingside pawn storm by playing pawn to f5, which may be played immediately at move 6, or after some preparation, such as by the double-edged move knight to h6. Also, in positions where black has moved his knight from f6 to d7 or e8, he may be able to play f5 as a blocking maneuver in the middle game. So you can see there's quite a lot to think about as early as move 6. Also, as we shall see, there are some deviations even earlier in the sequence, such as an early rook to b8, or playing pawn to e6 for black, or even instead of pawn to g6. Or black can try and fianchetto his queen's bishop. Before going on to the main lines, we shall spend some time looking at the deviations. You're quite likely to meet these irregular setups, even if the main line with 5 pawn to d6 is the most popular at master level. First, we shall look at a game from the match Chigorin versus Skiffers, played in Russia in 1897. Have your pieces set in the start position. That's just before move 1. Well, Chigorin was white. The game began 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to c3, black knight to c6, white pawn to g3, black pawn d6, white bishop to g2, pawn to e5. Since white has not taken much of the centre, black decides to play a form of stonewall. Naturally, to most white players, black pawn to e5 is pleasant to meet, as it means that when white himself plays the natural pawn to f4, he's almost bound to be able to open up the king's bishop file, a la King's Gambit, though without a pawn sacrifice. After black's pawn to e5, white continued knight from g1 to e2. Black moved pawn to f5. This looks very optimistic. Why open up the line of the white bishop at g2, especially after you have weakened d5? White played his pawn up to d3, black knight to f6, white pawn to f4. All those pawns in the centre may give you a headache, but white should be well off, as his king is nearer to castling than black's. Black captured, pawn takes e4, and white recaptured with his d pawn. D takes on e4, which also opens up the queen's file against the backward pawn at d6. Now black played his bishop in to g4. Black has been bringing out his forces very aggressively, but they lack bite. Chigorin continued in his own way by moving pawn to f5 here, which ensures him a kingside space advantage and a possibly dangerous pawn roller on that wing. Well, black here didn't play knight to d4, because white would probably just castle and then move pawn to h3. He decided to develop his position a bit more and moved bishop to e7. White played pawn to h3. Black captured, bishop takes on e2, and white recaptured with the knight, since he wants to play pawn to c3 later, which will deny black's knight on c6 a square at d4. Black here castled, and white castled, and black moved rook to c8. White played pawn to c3, as we predicted he would, which move also threatens queen to b3 check, forking the king and the pawn at b7. So in answer to that threat, black moved his king to h8. And now white advanced on the king side with pawn to g4. Well, seeing as pawn will be coming to g5 fairly soon, black anticipated this by moving his knight back to e8. Now I'd like you to switch off the tape and decide on how you would continue in this position for white. It's diagram 6. Well, a quite reasonable looking maneuver here is to play bishop to e3, followed by queen to d2 and perhaps then g5. Should black answer bishop to e3 by bishop to g5, which in theory exchanges off a bad bishop, then white could simply go queen to d2, and after bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, white will be able to move his rook to d1, which will put more pressure on the d file, and especially on the backward pawn at d6, which has just lost its defender by an exchange. However, in the position from diagram 6, Chigorin chose the move king to h2, possibly with the idea of moving knight to g1 to f3, followed by pawn advances on the king's side and a mating attack. That is, he retains his queen on a white square, ready to hop in at h5 should the time come. Still looks a bit tedious, though, and after all, the knight at e2 also had prospects if it simply went to g3. After white's king to h2, black moved rook to c7. White knight did go back to g1, and black moved rook to d7. White queen to e2, black knight to c7, white knight to f3, and black pawn to d5. The fact that black has been able to get the move in at all, that is, pawn to d5, advancing his backward d-pawn, must be rated as a success for him, and it does cast doubt on the previous white maneuvers. SICILIAN, however, continued nonchalantly in this position with pawn to h4. And this is where black made his big mistake. I'd like you to switch off and decide what the big mistake was. No, he didn't capture on h4. That would have been a very big mistake, and would have lost the bishop after pawn to g5. Black actually captured on e4 with his pawn. Perhaps he thought his major pieces would have scoped down the d-file, but this is a mirage, and meanwhile he enormously increases the scope of the white queen and the bishop at g2. Black's best in the position would have been to move his pawn down to d4, to use this pawn as a possible counterweight to white's kingside advance, at the same time shutting out the bishop at g2 again. However, as I said, black played pawn takes on e4. White played queen takes e4. And now black moved his knight back to e8. This has got the cunning threat of knight to d6 or knight to f6. Well, as it's time to turn over the tape to side 2, I'd like you to use the interim to decide on your next move for white in this position. Sicilian Close, Part 1, Side 2. In the game SICILIAN Shifers, which we've been looking at, after black's knight to e8, white played the tremendous move knight to g5. Not only is there a threat here of knight into e6, forking the queen and the rook, there's also a mating plan by pawn to f6, and if black plays knight takes f6, then rook takes f6 and queen takes h7 mate. If black moves his knight to f6 now, white can simply drop the queen back to e2, which incidentally guards the g-pawn. Look to how well the bishop at g2 is doing now. So, after white's knight to g5, black had to take bishop takes g5. White pawn takes g5. He doesn't take with the bishop because he wants to increase his pawn phalanx. Now, black didn't last very long in this position. Even without the pawn phalanx, white's got a very good game with his bishops sweeping the board. Black moved his knight to d6, white queen back to e3. e3. This is a nice reply. It threatens the c-pawn, and also to move the queen to h3 if necessary. Black moved queen to b6, and white pawn to g6. Black can't capture this pawn. If he plays pawn takes g6, white queen to h3 check, and bishop to d5 check. Denouement on those white squares that black had so consistently ignored throughout the game, starting with his moves pawn to f5 and bishop to g4, and ending with pawn takes e4 instead of pawn to d4. After white pawn to g6, black went back again, knight to e8, planning to transfer it to f6. Please switch off here and once more play white's move. It should be a pleasure. White moved queen to h3, black pawn to h6, and white bishop takes on h6. Again here, if black captures, white will mate very shortly with queen takes h6 check, black king to g8, bishop to d5 check, rook takes d5, and then queen takes on h7 mate. After white's bishop takes h6, Schriffers actually tried knight to f6, but he resigned after the moves bishop to g5 check, king to g8, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, queen to h7 check, since he's going to lose a rook. Well, that was one irregular answer disposed of in the grand manner. Now replace the pieces on their original squares again. Another plan for black, which however rarely succeeds, is to develop the bishop on e7 with the sort of setup that black generally has in the Richter-Rauser variation of the open Sicilian. The point is that when white avoids d2 to d4, the black setup with knights on c6 and f6 and a bishop on e7 with pawns on d6 and e6 loses a lot of its point, mainly because there's no real necessity for black to guard his backward d-pawn. Black has nothing to react against, and white can build up for his kingside attack. A more interesting plan for black is to play an early rook to b8. If we play the moves pawn to e4, black pawn c5, white knight c3, black knight c6, white pawn to g3, black can play on the queen side immediately with rook to b8, on the principle that if he is going to attack on the queen side, he might as well get on with it straight away. Of course, for attack read expansion. Black's queenside maneuvers rarely net him concrete gains, except increased space and perhaps greater weaknesses on that wing. After black rook to b8, white may move his bishop to g2, though this is not the only move. Black replies pawn to b5, white knight from g1 to e2, black pawn to e6. Here a thrust in the center by white looks tempting, but it is probably not good. For example, if we play pawn to d4, black could move pawn to b4, driving the white knight, back to b1, black plays pawn takes d4, white knight takes d4, black knight takes d4, and white queen takes d4. Here black bishop to a6 seems to give black some initiative. Now let us return our pieces to diagram 7. After the moves bishop to g2 and black pawn to b5. I once played 5 pawn to d3. Play continued, black pawn to e6, white bishop to f4, bringing the bishop out to attack the rook, black pawn to d6, white knight to f3, playing in the center. Black queen moved here to a5, and white castled. Black pawn to b4, white knight to b1, regrouping and aiming for the c4 square. Game continued with black moving his knight to f6, white knight from b1 to d2. Here black should have realized that he was too tender in the center and pushed up with pawn to e5, but instead he blundered. He played bishop to e7, white knight to c4, queen to c7, and now pawn to e5 by white, one material in all variations. Well, I suppose the danger with playing rook to b8 so early is that black may become so interested in his queenside play that he completely forgets about the center. It seems to me a better bet to play rook to b8 a little later, after a few other pieces have come out. Let's return to the initial position again. And we can play the moves 1 pawn to e4, pawn to c5, white knight to c3, knight to c6, g3, g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, 5 pawn to d3. Well, this is almost diagram 1. Difference is that black hasn't yet played pawn to d6. And in fact, the bulk of this tape is devoted to continuations where black does play pawn to d6. But anyway, let's look at the immediate rook to b8. Black is prepared to keep his king in the center for some time if necessary, and he'll have his fianchettoed bishop to lend some weight to the advance of his b-pawn. Probably white ought to play pawn to a4 here, and if black plays pawn to a6, then pawn to f4. There are a few practical examples of this variation, but it is, after all, a reversed English opening, so by studying some games that begin with 1 c4, e5, 2 knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, you could learn something about plans appropriate to a close Sicilian. In fact, there is a turnover book available, number 2 in the set on the English opening, a game between Smyslov and Lieberzon, which should prove very instructive here. Let us meanwhile look at a rather unusual example of play after 5 rook to b8. If you haven't the position set up, it's diagram 8. A game between Tarve and Tal, played in 1971, continued after black rook to b8 with white pawn to f4. Black moved pawn to b5, white pawn to a3, black pawn to a5, white knight to f3, black pawn to b4, white captured on b4, and black captured a takes b4. White retreated his attack knight to e2. Now black finally did move one of his center pawns. he played his pawn up to d6. White here castled, and black moved his knight to h6. Well, black's intention of moving the knight to h6 is obviously not to block his f-pawn, which he may later move up to f5. After knight to h6, white played pawn to h3. And here, Gale gives white a slight plus, no doubt due to black's insecure looking position on both sides of the board, vis-a-vis white's full development. Let us follow the game a little further. Black played here pawn to f5. A risky looking move aimed to block white's further expansion with pawn to f5. White answered knight to g5, which is an attempt to take advantage of two things. One of them is the undefended black knight at c6, undefended because black has moved his b-pawn. The second thing is to try and take advantage of the square e6, which has been weakened since black moved his pawn up to f5. I'd like you to switch off here and choose your reply for black. This is diagram 9. Well, you clearly had to do something about the knight at c6. Either queen c7 or knight d4 look possible, though not bishop to d7, to which white could reply e takes f5, followed by bishop takes c6 and knight into e6, forking the queen at d8 and the bishop at g7. In the actual game, Tull chose to move his queen to d7, which is a bit strange, but he probably has the intention of playing his queen's bishop to b7, in which case e6 is given protection by the queen. White answered king to h2, black castled. And now white saw profit to be made on the central white squares. He played e takes f5, black knight takes f5, white bishop to d5 check, and black king to h8. Well, of course black isn't afraid if white goes knight to f7 check. He'll just play rook takes knight, and then pawn to e6, trapping the unwary bishop. However, I'd like to ask you a question here. How would you answer for black if white simply plonked his knight in on e6? From diagram 10, should white play knight to e6, black has knight from f5 to d4, and white cannot capture the rook at f8 because of black queen takes h3 check. So instead of this, from diagram 10, Tave played pawn to g4. Black knight from f5 moved to d4. White captured on d4. And black recaptured with his knight. We can see that black has weathered the preliminary storm, and that must be accounted a success for him, though the chances are still about even. In the actual game, black gained control of the A file in the ending and eventually won. A modern example such as this shows the complexity of the play, complexity which in the long run will tend to favor the better player. I should now like to mention another totally different plan for black. This consists of playing an early pawn to e6. There's no need to reset your pieces here. Just look at the position in diagram 11. It arose after the moves pawn to e4, c5, knight c3, e6. Black's idea is to play an early pawn to d5, which will give him a lot of space in the center. Playing pawn to e6 as early as move 2 is more challenging than the older variant, where instead of pawn to e6, Black played knight to c6, white pawn g3, and then pawn to e6 on move 3. We shall discuss the subtleties of the pawn to e6 variation later on, as well as dealing with all the critical lines arising from 6 pawn to f4, or 6 bishop to e3 in today's main line. Having looked at some early alternatives for Black, I'd now like to pass on to 6th move deviations for White in the position in diagram 1. Instead of playing 6 pawn to f4, or 6 bishop to e3, White has also tried 6 bishop to g5, 6 knight to d5, and 6 knight to f3, all of which I consider too committal. And there have been alternative knight moves attempted, such as knight to h3 or knight from g1 to e2. The knight development at h3 is not to be recommended, except perhaps when Black has already played pawn to e5, as in a line we shall look at later on. A sound line after 6 knight to h3 is pawn to e6, while a Spassky Petrosian 1966 match game continued after 6 knight to h3, Black knight to f6, White castles, Black bishop to g4, White pawn up to f3, Black captured bishop takes h3, giving up the 2 bishops, White bishop takes h3, Black castles, bishop to e3, now Black knight to e8. Black is redeploying this knight on a less exposed square. White moved his queen to d2, Black slid round with knight to c7, rook from a1 to e1, pawn to b6. We can see that Petrosian is making no attempt to open up the position, which would tend to favor the white bishops. White moved knight to d1, and now pawn to d5, solidifying the center. White queen to e2, pawn to e6. As we can see from this, neither side has yet dented the opponent. The game was eventually drawn. Now please return your pieces to diagram 1. Smyslov's favorite move in this position used to be knight from g1 to e2. He used it often until the 15th game of the 1954 World Championship match, when his opponent Botvinnik found a good strategy for Black. Botvinnik played pawn to e5 immediately, planning, should White castle and play pawn to f4, for himself to play knight to g to e7 and pawn to f5. Instead, after Black pawn to e5, Smyslov tried to take advantage of the hole at d5. He played knight to d5, and Black challenged this piece by knight from g8 to e7. I'd like you to switch off here and study this position for a little while. Well, you might have thought in this position that White could go bishop to g5. It does look a very attractive move because it puts pressure on the weakened f6 square. It may not be that crushing though, because Black could play after bishop to g5, pawn to h6, then if, say, bishop to f6, that could probably move his king to f8, and later the king would come out to g7. It may also be possible, though it looks very risky, for black to play pawn to f5 in answer to bishop to g5. And if white doesn't check on f6, then black could anyway castle kingside. So, after black's knight g8 to e7, we'll pass on from the suggested bishop to g5, look at other moves for white. He could have defended his knight by moving his knight from e2 to c3, but then black could swap the knights and challenge again with knight to e7. Karpov has suggested that white retreat his knight to e3 in this position, that is, instead of playing knight from e2 to c3. This will keep the whole at d5 under surveillance. The actual game continuation did not go well for Smyslov. After black knight to e7, he continued with pawn to c3. Black played knight takes on d5, white pawn takes d5, black knight to e7. As we can see, the hole at d5 has now been plugged up, and there's more scope for black to expand on the king's wing. White castled, black castled. Pawn to f4. This is a challenging advance which black can ignore, as white has no power to push on the pawn to f5. Black simply developed bishop to d7, and white pawn to h3. Please switch off here and decide on your continuation as black. Black's chances here lie on the e-file, where white has a weak e3 square, and an uncomfortably placed knight. Black played queen to c7, and after white bishop to e3, moved rook from a8 to e8. And later on, black did secure the victory. Seems that 6 knight from g1 to e2 is rather slow. That is why 6 f4 and bishop to e3 are preferred nowadays. This latter line, the 6 bishop to e3 line, may also arise by transposition. Please reset your pieces in the start position. Sorry, go to diagram 1. Set your pieces in diagram 1, but without the move black pawn to d6. Have you got the right position? Well, instead of pawn to d6, black may here play pawn to e6, intending to continue with knight from g8 to e7 and pawn to d5. This maneuver you can find in the game Basman versus Flesh, which appears in the booklet. Now, to forestall this, white may play bishop to e3 on move 6, attacking the c-pawn. Should black now play pawn to d6, we'll soon be back in the main line. He may, however, choose to guard his pawn by moving pawn to b6, and we'll follow a game Medina-Benko from the 1970 Siegen Olympiad to see how this can turn out. After black's pawn to e6, bishop to e3, black pawn to b6, white answered queen to d2, and black played bishop to b7. White moved knight to g2 from e1, knight to e2 from g1, black knight from g8 to e7, white bishop to h6. Black castled. White pawn to h4. Well, white has done well to avoid castling kingside, as he is a formidable attack down the h-file. Black continued in hedgehog fashion with pawn to f6. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, white castle queenside. This he can do as black has as yet not advanced on the queen side. Black now played knight to d4. White knight did not take on d4, but moved. White played pawn to f4. Black pawn to h5. And now knight takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight to e2. Well, this pawn at d4 has to be guarded, so black played pawn to e5. Now please switch off and study this position for a while. White broke through strongly here with pawn to g4. Black pawn takes g4, and then pawn to h5. And Medina went on to register a good attacking win. In this example, certainly black's fianchetto on b7 did not seem to have much effect, and white just bulldozed through on the other side after the exchange of the black squared bishops. I think it's time to take a convenient break here, and we'll go on to study the main lines in detail after the interlude. It is time to look at the critical lines in more detail. Please have your pieces set up as in diagram 1. Now 6 pawn to f4 is the move favoured by Spassky. The most common replies are 6 knight to f6, 6 pawn to e6, and 6 pawn to e5. But first, a look at the alternatives. Fischer once played as black pawn to b6, white knight to f3, black bishop to b7, white castles, black queen to d7, intending to castle queenside. His opponent, Domnitz, should now have taken the initiative by a typical blow, pawn to f5, since if black takes the sacrifice by g takes f5, e takes f5, queen takes f5, white knight to g5 is very strong. Back to diagram 1. After 6 pawn to f4, black may also play rook to b8. We've seen this move, of course, before in other variations. We'll look now at a game where white developed with knight to f3 and black continued pawn to b5. White castled. This position is shown in diagram 13. From this position, the game Wade versus Byrne, which is analysed in a turnover book on the close Sicilian, continued with black going knight to f6, to which white's pawn to e5 put black in great danger. On the other hand, instead of knight to f6, black could push ahead with pawn to b4. White knight moves to d5, black pawn to e6, white knight to e3. White knight is quite well placed on e3 actually, because it does eye the f5 square. This leads to interesting play. The question is, has black's queenside expansion, at the expense of his kingside development, left him open to a white attack? We shall follow the game Kopylov versus Belov in 1963 with this in mind. That game continued knight g to e7. White surprisingly broke open the queenside with pawn to a3. Well, here if black captures on a3 and then tries to play bishop takes b2, he would eventually run into white queen to a1, which could be extremely embarrassing. So instead of that, he defended his b pawn with pawn to a5. White played a takes b4 and black a takes b4. And now white attacked with pawn to f5. Now please switch off here and study the consequences of this sacrificial advance. The position is shown in diagram 14 if you want to move any pieces around. As white's pawn to f5 is a very typical thrust, I think we should look at it in some detail. If black ignores the pawn at f5, then white can support it by playing pawn to g4. And black will always have to watch out for an eventual pawn to f6. If black captures the pawn at f5 with the e pawn, he will open up two files for white and also have to leave his d5 square unguarded by a pawn. A matter of some consequence, though not necessarily in this position. Should black capture with the g pawn, white recaptures, and then if black captures again, say with the e pawn, white can move his knight to h4 and should regain his pawn with pressure down the f file against the isolated f pawn. Well, faced with all these possibilities, from diagram 14, black chose to win a pawn in the least compromising way. He played e takes f5, white e takes f5, and now knight takes f5. White plays knight takes f5, and black bishop takes f5. Here, if white tries knight to h4, which discovers an attack upon the knight at c6, black can answer with bishop to d7. So instead of knight to h4, white could move knight to g5. Black moves his threatened knight to e5, which is a nice square because it guards the f7 pawn, and also the knight cannot yet be pushed away with pawn to d4. After black's knight to e5, white can move bishop to d5, black castles, and white rook to a7. White's building up a lot of pressure on the f pawn, but black nonetheless can offer good resistance, particularly as his knight at e5 is difficult to dislodge. He could play pawn to h6 here, when white may either retreat his knight to e4 or sacrifice at f7. For example, after pawn to h6, white knight takes f7, black knight takes f7, white rook takes f7, black rook takes f7. Now white pawn to g4. It looks here that white should regain his material if I haven't overlooked anything, though it's not clear that he has a definite advantage in that position. Please return the pieces to diagram 14. Do you have the right position? After e takes f5 and white e takes f5, black actually recaptured with the bishop, which doesn't seem quite as strong as taking with the knight. Why give up a bishop for a knight in such an open position? After white's knight takes f5, black knight takes f5, white knight to g5, black knight to e5. White could now drive one of the knights from its outpost with pawn to g4. If it goes to h4, white could continue with bishop to d5 and rook to a7 and so on. If it goes to h6, white simply moves pawn to h3. And if it goes back to e7, then white has knight to e4, with pressure against f6. We'll leave this variation with the remark that white appears to have good attacking chances with his pawn sacrifice pawn to f5. Now let's return again to diagram 1. If black doesn't wish to give white the opportunity of breaking through on the f-file so early in the game, he can play, instead of rook to b8, the blocking move pawn to f5. Let's look at the position from diagram 1, where white goes pawn to f4, and black goes immediately pawn to f5. This line has generally been ignored, though it was played in a game Smyslov versus Larsen in the 1958 Olympiad. That game continued with white knight to f3, black knight to f6, white castles, and black castles. Then white played king to h1 to free g1 for his bishop, which might go there via e3. There followed bishop to d7, bishop e3, rook to b8, white queen to e2. Isn't much point in putting the queen on d2 since the line to h6 has been blocked. And if you put the queen on e2, then you may be able to get some pressure down this e-file, which has been slightly weakened when black played pawn to f5. So queen to e2, black pawn to b5, white bishop to g1, black pawn to b4, white knight to d1, black knight to e8. This knight is coming round to c7 to survey the squares e6 and d5. Meanwhile, the black pawn at f5 represents a firm barrier to white's kingside ambitions, as in the Tarve-Tal example we've already looked at. The game now continued with white pawn to c3, black knight to c7, white rook from a1 to c1. And here, according to Boleslavsky, black should have tried the maneuver queen to c8 to a6. Instead, he lost the initiative by playing knight to e6. White knight came out into e3, as in the previous example. Black queen to a5, and white e-takes on f5. Please return again to diagram 1. A variant on the same idea is to play after white's pawn to f4, black knight to h6, to make the recapture at f5 with the knight if necessary, or to place it on f7, where it defends stoutly. From diagram 1, after 6f4, black knight h6, white knight f3, black pawn to f5, white castles, black castles. We reach the position in diagram 16. Please switch off here and study it. A game Blatny versus Malik, Dessin 1975, continued white pawn takes on f5. Black recaptured with the knight. The pawn recapture is also possible, but retaking with the knight increases the scope of black's queen's bishop and knights. White continued knight e2, black king h8, pawn c3, bishop d7, queen e1, e5, g4, knight h6, h3, queen to b6, king to h1, rook from a8 to e8. This game looks more like an example of how not to play as white. His aimless moves have given black an easy game, and as in the Smyslov-Botvinnik example we looked at earlier, black has taken over the central files. Back now to diagram 16. Instead of capturing on f5, white should play pawn to h3, or possibly king to h1. But we'll look at pawn to h3. Black moves bishop to d7, white bishop to e3, black knight to d4. See, white is refraining from capturing on f5, which would increase the scope of black's pieces. White moves now queen to d2, black knight to f7, and white rook from a1 to e1. This is obviously a better development position for white than in the previous example. Here a critical test for the variation is whether black can play pawn to e5 here, as recommended by Gligorich and Sokolov in their book on the Sicilian. Instead of pawn to e5, against Smiderovich-Sokolov continued with black king to h8, white knight to d1, white's getting ready to eject that knight at d4, black queen to c7. And here white made gains in the center. First he played knight to h4, black moved rook a8 to e8, white pawn to c3, black knight c6, and now finally white did exchange on f5. E takes f5, g takes f5, and now pawn to d4. The point of this is to hold up black's desired advance pawn to e5, as well as making space gains in the center. So much then for the lines in which black meets pawn to f4 on move 6 by plans based on pawn to f5. They're certainly annoying for white because he has to modify his intentions. He isn't able immediately to push through on the king's side. But maybe, in the long run, ways can be found for white to exploit the potential weakness of the squares like e6, as in the last example. This is the end of tape 1. If you want to look at some other defenses of black on move 6, they can be found on tape 2. Please have your pieces set up as in diagram 1. After 6 pawn to f4, black is quite likely to play knight to f6, white knight to f3, castles, castles, black rook to b8. This variation, which we already saw in the second Spassky-Geller match game, shows the kingside attack versus the queenside attack in its purest form. The position is shown in diagram 17. There are three popular moves here: 9 pawn to a4, 9 knight to h4, and 9 pawn to h3, though the first is less common than the others. The game Felsted versus Taimanov, played 10 years ago, went pawn to a4, black pawn to a6, white knight to h4. White is trying to prevent pawn to b5, which could here be answered by pawn to e5. But Taimanov just played bishop to d7, guarding his knight at c6. White moved pawn to f5, black pawn to b5. White pawn takes b5, and black pawn takes b5. White bishop moved to g5, pawn to b4, knight to e2, queen to b6, white queen to d2, and black rook to a8, leading to a double-edged game. Since pawn to b5 cannot be stopped forever, the move pawn to a4 loses individual significance, and that is why knight to h4 is rather more popular, as in the second match game already referred to. But as white did not get any clear advantage there either, Spassky switched to pawn to h3 in the fourth and the sixth games. This is in fact the best. Instead of playing for an immediate pawn to f5, white aims for pawn to g4, and possibly will transfer his queen from e1 to h4. The squares d4 and e5 are not abandoned to black without a fight. From diagram 17 then, and please have your pieces set up in that position, after white's pawn to h3, black moves pawn to b5. Now white can either ignore black's queenside advance or try to oppose it. Spassky chose here pawn to a3, bearing in mind that if black now pushes with pawn to b4, he will open up the a file for white to attack his a pawn. So after pawn to a3, black chose pawn to a5, white bishop to e3, black pawn to b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, and white knight to e2. This position is similar to the Felsted-Taimanov game we've just looked at, except instead of knight to h4 and f5, white has moved pawn to h3 and bishop to e3. In fact, this position, shown in diagram 18, was reached in 3 games of the 1968 candidates matches. 1 game Rzewski versus Korchnoi, and 2 Spassky-Geller games. So, as it was such a popular position, I'd like you to switch off and decide on your plans for black here. Let's look first at how Rzewski-Korchnoi continued. Korchnoi decided on a rather long knight maneuver, knight to e8, which incidentally attacks white's b-pawn. White played rook to b1, black knight to c7, white pawn to f5, black knight came to b5. It's one way of getting to d4. White queen to d2, black knight from b5 into d4. White knight came to h4. Black played knight takes e2. White queen takes e2. Black knight to e5. And white knight back to f3. An interesting conversation is going on between these four knights. It ends with all of them coming off the boards, which brings out in sharper relief white's kingside pressure. Black played knight takes f3 here. White queen takes f3. Black bishop to b7. White pawn to h4. Black king to h8. Here the move pawn to g4 would have been in white's favour, though he did not play it. Back now to diagram 18 again. Sorry, just back to diagram 18. The second game we'll look at was Spassky-Geller, and black did not move his knight to e8 in this position. He played his bishop to b7. Spassky did not immediately find the right answers to this. He continued queen to d2. Black rook moved to a8, and white rook moved from a1 to b1. Now after black's queen to a5, white should probably have played pawn to f5, but in fact he went pawn to b3. Now switch off here and decide how you would play as black. Black's sharpest move here would be pawn to d5. Should white capture this pawn, black could recapture with his knight, threatening the white bishop at e3, and he would then be ready to follow up with rook to d8, with good pressure down the center. The real point of pawn to d5 comes if white pushes on with pawn to e5. Then black has the move pawn to d4. And white's capture at f6 is answered by a black capture at e3, attacking the white queen at d2. Thus, after pawn to d5, white pawn to e5, black pawn to d4, white would have to retreat his bishop to f2. And then black could move his knight in to d5, with good control in the center and on the queen side. As played, Geller missed the move pawn to d5, and after an up and down struggle, in which both players missed wins, Spassky eventually did score the point. In the sixth game, from diagram 18, if you'll return your pieces to that position again, after black's bishop to b7, Spassky improved here with pawn to b3. Black rook to a8, white rook to c1. But even so, Geller did miss chances to equalize here. See the turnover books if you want the complete game. Probably the most precise way for white to pursue the attack from diagram 18 after bishop to b7 is pawn to g4, black rook to a8, white rook to b1. Note that white always uses this rook as a defensive piece. If he exchanged it for the black rook, then other pieces would be tied down to the defense of the queen side. After white rook to b1, a Russian game, Bakulin-Shatkes, 1970, continued black rook to a2, white knight c1, black rook a6, white queen e1. black queen c7, white knight comes back to e2, black rook back to a2. Now white queen to h4, with an accelerating initiative on the king's side. Please return your pieces again, this time to diagram 17. In this position, white can also try to cash in his chips on the king's side with an immediate pawn rush, as occurred in the game Smyslov-Taimanov, Soviet Spartakiad 1958. Against good defense, it probably is not as good as Spassky's build-up with h3 and bishop to e3, but it's still dangerous. Continuation of Smyslov-Taimanov, diagram 17, was pawn to h3, black pawn to b5, white pawn to g4. Here, if black plays pawn to c4, white could answer with pawn to e5. So Taimanov played pawn to b4, white knight to e2, and now pawn to c4. I'd like you to switch off here and consider this new assault on white's position. When black plays a move like pawn to c4, which aims to open the c-file and also perhaps to bring a bishop to a6 with pressure on white's d-pawn, white can often answer by occupying the d4 square. In this game, Smyslov played bishop to e3. Black played bishop to a6, and white's knight on e2 went to d4. Black played knight takes d4, white bishop takes d4. Black queen to c7, threatening an invasion on the c-file. White played his rook up to f2, which guards laterally the c2 square in case black should wish to attack there. Or black played now rook from f8 to e8, and white pushed on, pawn to f5. We can see that things are panning out well for white. He has taken advantage of black's pawn to c4, and his kingside pawns look ominous. Meanwhile, his rooks guard the entry points on the queen-bishop file, should black try to invade there. In view of the white threats of pawn to e5 and perhaps pawn to g5, black tried to defend actively with pawn to e5 here. White played pawn takes on e6, and black pawn takes on e6. That, of course, was en passant capture. Now pawn to e5 for white. Black cannot capture this pawn, as then there would come bishop takes e5, securing the queen and the rook. So black moved his knight to d5, and white played pawn takes on d6. Now a question: how would you play for white should black recapture on d6 with the queen? Please switch off and consider this question. The answer is that you would win a piece by playing bishop takes g7, black king takes g7, white pawn takes on c4, black bishop takes c4, and now queen to d4 check, picking up the bishop. An interesting use of pins and checks and forks in these variations. Return now the pieces to diagram 20. After pawn takes on d6, black moved queen to d7. White played pawn takes c4. And here black tried for complications with knight to f4. White bishop takes g7. Black queen takes g7. Now white queen to d4. There's no nonsense with this move. White's just going to exchange queens into a very powerful endgame. Black moved knight takes g2. Queen takes g7 check. King takes g7. White king takes g2. Black bishop takes c4. White knight to e5. This is the position white is aiming for, with his knight unassailable at e5 and possible invasion down the f-file. Black moved his attacked bishop to d5, checking the king, which moved up to g3. Black moved rook e8 to d8. White pawn to d7. Here black resigned because the white rooks are going to invade on f7 soon. Does all this analysis mean that after white's sixth move, pawn to f4, that black knight to f6 is a mistake? Probably, although some improvement may be possible. From diagram 1, after pawn to f4, black knight to f6, white knight to f3, black castles and white castles, black has only tried bishop to d7 and rook to b8. But bishop to g4 may also be possible, with the continuation white pawn h3, black bishop takes f3, white bishop takes f3, black knight to d4, white bishop to g2, and black rook to c8. This is according to a recent Russian book on Geller. White could also vary in this position by recapturing with the queen on f3, and if black goes knight to d4, he can retreat the queen to f2, which guards the c-pawn. He could later follow up with knight to d1 and pawn c3, ejecting the knight at d4. Another move that comes into consideration on move 8, besides black bishop to g4, is to play knight from f6 to e8. Then if white goes pawn to h3, black can move pawn to f5. This would lead to positions similar to the Smyslov-Larsen encounter, which we examined earlier. Now, please reset your pieces at diagram 1. After 3 losses in the f4, black knight to f6 line, Geller switched to pawn to e6 in the 8th game. Play invariably continues white knight to f3, black knight from g8 to e7, and white castles. This is diagram 21. In this variation, black is ready to occupy the important square d4, and in some variations he may be able to play pawn to d5 or pawn to f5. He also keeps the option of advancing his b-pawn. It is not nearly so easy for white to build up his attack in this line. One thing he must be careful about is the answer to black's central challenge when it comes. In one of my games, my opponent played immediately black knight to d4.
hoping perhaps for knight takes d4, then black pawn takes d4, and later being able to build up pressure down the c-file. The half-open c-file is normal for black in the open Sicilian, and one of the good points of the closed Sicilian is that black does not obtain that advantage normally. However, black knight to d4 is premature because white has not yet moved his queen's bishop. This means that b2 is protected, and so I was able to play knight from c3 to e2. Black castled, white pawn to c3, black knight takes f3 check, white bishop takes f3, followed by white bishop to e3 and queen to d2. White has the choice of building up on the king side for an eventual f4, f5 breakthrough, possibly preceded by g3 to g4. Let's now look at another example of black playing an early knight to d4, which is quite a popular continuation from the black side. This is the game Basman-Lambert, Evening Standard, Congress 1978. From diagram 21, after black castled, white played king to h1. And now black moved knight to d4. In this case, white captured the knight with knight takes d4, black pawn takes d4, white knight moved back to e2, and black moved bishop to d7. As we can see, black is trying out his plan of building up on the c-file against white's c-pawn. So, rather than have it a sitting weakness on c2, white decided to obtain more control of the center and moved pawn to c3. Black didn't want to give up the center yet, so he defended his pawn at d4 with knight to c6. This knight, unfortunately, is no longer able to play a part in preventing white's pawn to f5, and also it prevents black from playing rook to c8. But that doesn't mean that black knight to c6 wasn't the best move in this situation. Well, white brought his bishop to d2, and black played rook to c8. White now played his queen out to b3. You can see at this moment white is not trying for a kingside attack, for which black is ready prepared. First he plays over the whole board. Well, white isn't really threatening the b-pawn, but nonetheless black moved it to b5 in order to give himself more space on the queen side. He sees that white cannot capture this pawn because of a discovery with the black knight at some point. Well, white ignored the pawn sacrifice, just played his rook from a1 to c1. Black moved his queen out to b6, another piece defending the d4 square. Now, having contained black on the queen side, white expanded on the other wing with pawn to g4. The remainder of this game can be found in the booklet. In it, white did obtain the advantage, but later on the game was drawn. Now please return again to diagram 21. We'll look at some other black defences. Black rook to b8 has been played here, though white's reply pawn to e5, which is very sharp, is reckoned to give him the edge. Please switch off and study this advance for a few minutes. Should black answer white's pawn to e5 with pawn to d5, white obtains a position analogous to the king's Indian attack, where his e5 pawn wedge gives him good attacking chances. You may be wondering why black does not simply capture the pawn. So if you haven't decided on a continuation for white in that event, switch off here and decide how white should reply to black's pawn takes on e5. White has many attractive continuations here, though perhaps the clearest is pawn takes e5, black knight takes on e5, and white bishop to f4. Then if black plays knight takes f3 check, white will move queen takes f3, and as black's rook is attacked, it moves to a8. Now white can simply move bishop to e3, attacking the pawns at f7 and e3, and retaining pressure against black's queen side. So we'll leave black's rook to b8 idea and return again to diagram 21. Black usually plays castles kingside here, leaving white with a difficult choice. Possible here are pawn to a3, white king to h1, white knight to e2, maybe rook to b1, or bishop to d2, or bishop to e3. And there are other moves such as pawn to h3, pawn to g3, or queen to e1, which should not also be too lightly dismissed. So let's study this very critical position in some more detail. We saw in the last example white playing king to h1 and then black moving knight to d4. Now we'll look at a more direct attempt of white bringing his bishop from c1 onto e3. This move carries the threat of white pawn to d4. So black generally stops this by moving his knight into d4. Now unfortunately white cannot capture knight takes on d4 because of black pawn takes d4, which forks two pieces. Furthermore, if he plays knight to e2 here, he loses the b pawn after knight takes knight check. One game weighed against Matanovich, Vinkovci, 1968, continued here with white playing queen to d2, and black moved up in the center, pawn to d5. White played pawn takes d5, black pawn takes d5. Here white saw the opportunity to double black's pawns in the center and continued bishop takes d4. Black played pawn takes d4, and white knight moved back to e2. I'd like you to switch off here and study the position for a while. Normally doubled pawns are a disadvantage, but not in this case, as black has the strong maneuver knight to f5 and then to e3 in hand. The rest of this game may be found in the booklet. Well, let us return again to diagram 21, adding the moves white bishop to e3 and black knight to d4. In another game, and this was Wade against Ray, T-side 1972, white tried bishop to f2 immediately, so as to be ready to capture on d4 with the knight when necessary. That game also went in black's favor after black moved pawn to f5, queen to d2. Though it seems to me that if instead of queen to d2, had white played knight takes d4, black pawn takes d4, white knight to e2, now maybe black pawn to e5, answered by white pawn to c3, position wouldn't be bad for white. Well, you can see from these examples that they tend to differ from the other examples with knight to f6, in that black is playing more in the center, and this tends to give white more difficulties than the queen's wing attack. Now, if you'll return the pieces to diagram 21 again, we'll see what the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings has to say about the position. After white plays bishop to e3 and black knight to d4, the Encyclopedia recommends rook to b1, preparing to play knight to e2 without losing the b-pawn. Then white could play pawn to c3 and finally eliminate the knight at d4, while retaining an uncompromised pawn position. The game Seledkin versus Gutmann continued with black moving bishop to d7. A white knight went to e2. Black knight takes f3 check. He wants to capture the knight, which has more scope in the center. White's knight on e2 hasn't yet got much scope. White recaptured bishop takes f3, black bishop to c6, and white pawn to g4. This is as much to prepare pawn to f5 as to give the knight a square on g3. Now, after white's pawn to g4, black challenged with pawn to f5. White played knight to g3, and black queen to d7. Position is rather difficult to assess. You can see the game is only just beginning. Black has developed well and fortified on f5, while white may continue with moves like queen to e2 and then to g2, keeping up the pressure. Let's return once more to our critical diagram 21. Have you reset the pieces? We're going to look at another popular move, generally employed by Spassky. This is to play the bishop up to d2. The idea of this is that since a position of stalemate has been reached on the king's side, matters should be made concrete on the queen's wing first. The third Spassky-Larsen match game 1968 now continued in this fashion. Black rook to b8, white rook to b1, black pawn to b5, white pawn to a3, and black pawn to a5. I'd like you to switch off here and study the position. In face of black's avalanche, which white had prepared an interesting plan. He played pawn to a4. This forces black either to block the queen side or to capture on a4. Larsen actually chose to block. He moved his pawn up to b4. White knight came into b5. And now black found he could not continue bishop to a6 trying to win a pawn because of the reply white pawn to c4. Black pawn takes pawn en passant, and white pawn takes pawn. As you can see, the rook at b1 cunningly guards the knight at b5. You'll find this game examined in Turnover Book number 2 on the Sicilian close. Meanwhile, we shall return to diagram 22 and examine the consequences of black capturing at a4 after white's pawn to queen's rook 4. I hope you have the right position before you. We'll play this black capture on a4, which Larsen possibly rejected because he didn't wish to give himself a weak a-pawn. However, his pieces do seem to get more play in this way. For a start, the rook at b8 has an open line. Our game between Marjanovic against Deeks went in black's favour after white played knight takes a4, and black moved his knight in to d4. This puts white in a slight quandary, because if he wants to drive away that knight on d4 with pawn to c3, then his own knight on a4 may be out on a limb. In the actual game, white played pawn to b3, thus creating a barrier down on this b file against black's rook. Black played bishop to d7, and white moved from knight from a4 to c3. Now black moved the knight from e7 to c6, with white at a loss for an aggressive continuation. So let's see if we can improve white's play from diagram 22 again. Let's see, black's played pawn takes pawn, white knight takes a4, and black knight into d4. We can try here knight takes d4 by white. Black plays bishop takes d4 check. White king to h1. Black bishop to d7. Now white knight to c3. And black pawn to a4. This is to pin white's b-pawn down. Well, as black is attacking on the queen side, white may now expand on the king side with pawn to g4. Black could block with pawn to f5. Now white can open the g-file with g-pawn takes on f5, black g-pawn takes on f5. Let's see, perhaps here white could play rook to f3, and it seems to me he's getting pressure on the king side, which counterbalances black's obvious pressure on the queen side. Well, the positions arising after black pawn to e6 are certainly the most complex strategically, and it will be a long time before it can be said that they are played out. May the better player win. Let us now turn to another critical line, the one in which the player is often sharper. Please return again to diagram 1. Now add the moves 6, pawn to f4, and for black, pawn to e5. Switch off here and study this position for about 5 minutes. This move, which Botvinnik regularly employed against white's bishop to e3 on move 6 and white knight from g1 to e2, has its drawbacks here in that white is able to use the f-file. The pawn structure begins to resemble the king's gambit, and as we know, Spassky is an expert at the king's gambit. After black pawn to e5, white can play his knight to f3. Black knight from g8 to e7, white castles, black castles, and white bishop to e3, a line which can also arise if white had chosen bishop to e3 on move 6. A recent example of this is the first Larsen-Spassky match game of 1977, which continued black knight to d4, white queen went up to d2, black pawn takes f4, white bishop takes on f4. Had white recaptured with the pawn, black would have answered pawn to f5. Recapturing with the bishop means that the white pieces get more scope. Nonetheless, the position went in black's favor after he played knight takes on f3 check, white rook takes on f3, black queen to b6, white rook to b1, black bishop e6, white bishop to g5, black knight to c6, white bishop went back to e3, now the black knight came into e5. This sort of position shows what black is aiming for when he plays pawn to e5 on move 6, the control of the central black squares and the fossilization of white's bishop at g2. Well, I think that's enough for this side, so if you want to hear more about the variation, please turn over to side 2. Sicilian close, tape 2, side 2. Please have your pieces set up in diagram 1 and add the moves 6 pawn to f4 and black pawn to e5. Spassky usually prefers here knight from g1 to h3, because then black cannot just carry on castling. If, for example, he plays knight f6, white castles, and so does black, then white pawn to f5 gives white the initiative on the king's side. Of course, when there's a knight on f3, as in the previous example of Larsen-Portisch, then there's no rook to support the advanced pawn to f5. Well, after knight to h3, instead of playing knight to f6, black should of course move his knight to e7 from g8. White again castles. And now, can black do the same? Let's look at a game where he does. It's a short one. After black castles, white still plays pawn to f5. A pawn sacrifice to exploit the white squares on the king side. Black moves pawn takes f5. He might as well, otherwise white will support with pawn to g4 later. White captures pawn takes f5. Black bishop takes f5. How would you now continue for white? Switch off and decide on your move. In the game in question, Bielek against Georgiou, white played rook takes on f5, getting rid of black's white square defender. Black captured knight takes f5. Bishop from g2 went to e4. We've thus reached diagram 23. Black has quite a few problems here. If he retreats his knight on f5 to e7, well then white can play bishop takes h7 check, followed by queen to h5 check and knight to g5. If he plays the other knight, the one on c6 to e7, the continuation then might be queen to h5, black queen d7, white knight into d5, black pawn to h6. Now white can even win a piece here with bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, queen takes f5. This is due to the fact that he can now fork on e7 with the knight. Well, he doesn't actually win a piece in the end. He comes out with 2 pieces against a rook, but he should have no difficulty winning that. Let's go back to diagram 23. Now black could also move his knight from c6 to d4. But then white will play his knight to d5 and follow up with pawn to c3. So that leaves just one other knight move, and that was the one that black played. Knight from f5 to d4. White queen to h5. Obviously black would love to play pawn to f5 here, but that isn't much good after white goes bishop to d5 check, followed by knight to g5, and then after black plays pawn to h6, white can move queen to g6, threatening a mate on h7. And of course if black plays pawn takes knight, white moves his queen back to h5, and it's going to be mate next move. So in view of that tactical continuation, black decided to give up his h-pawn after white's queen to h5 and just moved his rook to e8. White played queen takes h7 check, black king f8, white bishop to g5. Black moved his attacked queen to d7. White just brought more pieces in. Knight to d5, rook e6, white rook to f1. Not much black could think of doing here, so he had a pawn. Knight takes c2. White bishop to g6. Black knight from c2 to d4. Now white bishop came to h6, and black resigned here. It looks as though black is unwise to castle kingside, and in a later game, Spassky against Hort from Bugoyno 1978, black tried for queenside castling. This also resulted in a loss for black, and the full game can be found analyzed in turnover book number 3 on the Sicilian close. Now return your pieces to the position in diagram 24. Instead of walking into it by castling kingside, black can also play e takes on f4. The natural move here is to recapture with the knight, though in the game Spassky against Portish, white played bishop takes on f4. Black moved his pawn up to h6, white rook to b1. This is, of course, to free the queen's knight, and perhaps prepare a queenside onrush should black venture to castle there. Black now did castle kingside, since he no longer fears white's pawn push up to f5. White moved pawn to a3, black bishop to e6. Perhaps black is aiming to play pawn to d5 here, in answer to white's threat of queen d2 and pawn to b4. And Spassky now maneuvers to prevent pawn to d5. Please switch off and study this position, and with the last clue in mind, try to discover what Spassky's actual continuation was. Well, white played bishop to e3, black knight to e5, white knight came to f4, as we can see, attacking the d5 square, and the bishop on e6, which moved back to d7. White played king to h1, black rook c8, white queen to d2. Both sides calmly moving their pieces around. Black king h7, white pawn h3, black bishop c6, white pawn to g4. Well, this move pawn to g4 is as much an expansion on the king's side as a prevention. That is, white wants to prevent black playing pawn to f5. Now we get another lot of maneuvering. Black played queen to d7, white rook f2, black pawn to b6. White doubled on the f-file, rook from b1 to f1. Black bishop b7, white queen to e2. Black rook from c8 went to e8. And white bishop went the way back to c1. If you're not quite sure what white is up to, switch off the tape again and study the position for about 5 minutes. Now we'll carry on again. Black king g8, white queen e3, black pawn b5, white queen to g3. White slowly transferred his queen over to the king's side, and he still retains his very strong rooks doubled on the f-file. Now black is trying to obtain counterplay on the queen's side, as he sees he can't hang out for long if he doesn't do so. He played pawn to b4, white captured pawn takes b4, black pawn takes b4, white knight to d1, black pawn to d5. It looks like that black is now making progress. After all, he has got in pawn to d5. So it's important for white to play very accurately at this point. I'd like you to switch off and consider how you would play as white in this position. Spassky's continuation here was pawn to d4. The black knight attacked, went back to c6, which incidentally attacks white's d-pawn twice. White himself captured on d5, and black captured on d4 with the knight. White's last move was pawn takes d5. Black played knight takes d4. And now to defend the d-pawn, white moved up pawn to c4. Black captured en passant, pawn takes c3. White pawn takes c3. Black knight to b3. So this move attacks white's bishop on c1, and also there's still the attack on white's pawn at d5. So it's not clear yet whether the central white pawns are strong or weak. White moved his attacked bishop out to a3, which therefore prevents black from capturing on d5 because of the pin against black rook on f8. Black moved his rook from e8 to c8, which is obviously a good move because he wants to restrain the advance of white's queenside and central pawns. White moved his pawn up to c4. This move is only possible because the white queen at g3 now attacks the black knight at b3. And possibly surprised by the last move, black moved his knight back to a5. Much more sound would have been moving the knight to c5, thus blockading the pawns. Still, knight to a5 looked at first sight attractive because white's pawn at c4 is now completely undefended. However, it wasn't that good because white now switched his rooks onto the e-file, rook to e2, and black had to defend his knight with rook from f8 to e8. Now, how would you play as white in this position? Switch off and decide on your move. It certainly appears that this position must have arisen when one or other side was in time trouble, because here white could just play queen to e1, hitting both the knights on e7 and a5. Thus we are reminded that black should have moved his knight back to c5 earlier on. Well, white's actual move was to move his other rook from f1 to e1, which is also quite strong. Now black moved his bishop back to f8. Now, try and make up for white's omission on the last move and find a good move for him at this point. Switch off again. White made up for his blunder on the previous move by playing knight to h5 here, threatening a knight fork at f6. If the knight is captured, white's queen and bishops will make a meal of the black king after pawn takes pawn discovered check. Well, we can see that knight to h5 had black a little worried, for he now played knight takes d5. White pawn takes d5. Black pawn takes h5. White pawn takes h5, discovered check. Black moved his bishop to g7. White bishop to g2. Bishop to b2. Of course, threatening mate. Black stopped this with pawn to f6, not very effectively. Bishop takes f6. Black rook takes e2. White rook takes e2. Black queen f7. White rook to e6. And here black resigned because he's faced with something simple like bishop takes g7 and rook to g6, which will win his queen. That was a very nice steady push by Spassky, culminating in a crushing onslaught. And so it looks as though white should be quite happy if black meets his 6 pawn to f4 by playing pawn to e5. If white is worried in case black plays the pawn to e6 line in answer to pawn to f4, or just wants to change, he may prefer to play bishop to e3 from diagram 1. The Harding-Hartston game at the beginning of tape 1 showed that white could get a good game against pawn to e6 by trying to exploit the weak squares at h6 and f6. In practice, therefore, black defends differently after white's bishop to e3. From diagram 1, after white bishop to e3, black may play knight to f6. Then white can reply pawn to h3 to stop black's knight to g4. Black castles kingside. White queen to d2. Black knight to d4. White knight c3 moves to e2. And then white can play, say, pawn to c3 and pawn to f4. Now return again to diagram 1. After 6 bishop to e3, black can play knight to h6. And here we can follow an amusing game, Smyslov versus Bronstein, of 25 years back. White plays queen c1. Black knight came to g4. White bishop to d2. Other black knight went into d4. White pawn to h3. Black knight went back to e5. Of course, black's knights look quite well placed here, but they can be dislodged by moves like pawn to f4 and pawn to c3. White moved his knight from c3 to e2, and black played queen to b6. And now white tried to push black back with pawn to f4. Please switch off here and study the position a while. In fact, try and discover what peculiar combination Bronstein now developed. Instead of simply retreating the knight, black came up with an amazing combination. He played knight takes c2 check, white queen takes c2, and black queen takes on b2. White played queen takes b2, black knight takes on d3 check, forking the king and the queen. White's king had to move and it went to f1. Now black played bishop takes b2, and white rook went to b1. Black has sacrificed a piece, but in return he has gained 3 pawns, and it seems to me that had he retreated his bishop to g7 here, his game would not be bad. However, he continued to play with fire in this position, and moved bishop to e6, attacking white's a pawn, but also leaving his own b pawn unguarded. White answered sharply with bishop to c3, and here once again, instead of the prosaic bishop takes bishop, black moved bishop takes a2. This really does look too much. White played rook takes b2, black knight takes b2, white bishop takes b2, and black's 4 pawns plus rook proved insufficient against white's minor pieces. Well, I suppose that is an atypical example. Please return again to diagram 1. After 6, white bishop to e3, black can also play his rook to b8. This plan worked out well in Hecht versus Keen, which we will follow here. White played his knight to f3, black moved knight f6, white pawn h3, this of course to prevent knight g4. Black pawn to b5, white queen d2, pawn to b4, white knight to d1, black bishop to a6. Black is rapidly building up an initiative on the queen side. It seems best to castle here. No doubt it would also have been better to have the knight on e2 rather than d1. At any rate, it's very interesting to compare this game with one of those we looked at earlier between Smyslov and Taimanov, which showed similar queenside advances by black, but with a totally different result. If you remember, in the Smyslov-Taimanov game, Smyslov, as soon as black played pawn to c4, was able to take over the d4 square, and this gave him the advantage. But here white finds himself badly placed to carry out such a plan. Now, let's see, after black bishop to a6, white moved his knight to h4. Black castled, and white castled. And here Keen came to grips with pawn to c4. White finally moved his pawn up to f4, and black went queen to c7, starting the pressure on the c file. White instinctively put his rook up on f2 in order to guard his second rank. And black moved his rook not to c8, but to d8. This was the rook from f8 to d8. White played pawn d4, black pawn to d5, and white pawn to e5. Well, please switch off and study this position for a while. This would be a nice position for white, where, say, his knight, instead of being on d1, on f2. And then black's knight from f6 would have to retreat. But as white has not placed his pieces in the best way, black was able, instead of retreating, to put his knight in onto e4. White had to capture with bishop takes e4. And now, seeing that white had parted with his king's bishop, the one which defends white squares, Keen inserted an imaginative pawn sacrifice to increase his scope on the white squares. He played pawn c3, white pawn takes on c3, and black pawn takes on e4. With white under great pressure, you can see the scope of black's bishop on a6 has been greatly enhanced by the pawn c3 move. Keen won a fine game. On the evidence of this game, white's maneuver with bishop to e3 and queen to d2 seems to allow black greater chances of success on the queen side than in the pawn to f4 lines. Perhaps it's because white has developed his queen side to it so early, perhaps because he hasn't got enough space to maneuver his pieces, space which he obtains when he plays pawn to f4. However, white's experience has not always been as traumatic as in the Hecht versus Keen game. We'll just mention the game Smyslov versus Bobby Fischer from Zagreb 1970, which continued from diagram 1 with 6 white bishop to e3. Hope you have the position set up. 6 bishop to e3, black rook b8, white queen d2, black pawn b5, white knight to f3, black pawn to b4, white knight to d1. And here Fischer did not employ Keen's plan of bishop to a6 and pawn to c4, but decided to relieve some of the tension in the position by moving bishop to g4. White played pawn h3, bishop takes f3, white bishop took on f3, black knight f6, white bishop went back to g2. And here white's two bishops gave him a slight advantage, though the game was eventually drawn. Fischer in those days hardly ever lost games. Let's move on from the rook b8 counterattack, which envisages an advance on the queen side, and study the central thrust, black pawn to e5 instead. We've seen this before in answer to black pawn to f4. And here, to give the line some individuality, white often continues with queen to d2, as in Hort versus Portisch, Beverwijk 1968. Let's just look at the continuation of that game. This is from diagram 1, bishop e3, pawn to e5, white queen to d2. Black played knight from g8 to e7, white pawn to h4, black pawn h5, white knight to h3, black knight to d4, white pawn to f4, black bishop g4, white castled, black e takes on f4, white bishop takes on f4, black castled, white rook to f2, black king to h7, and white rook from a1 to f1. Here white, with his pressure down the f-file, has a good game, though we should point out that the position reached could just as well have come out of the pawn to f4 variation. The strategy appears to have been the same. This brings us to the end of the variations where black fianchettos his king's bishop. The last line I want to look at begins from the starting position if you'll have the starting position set up. One pawn to e4, black pawn c5, white knight c3, and now black pawn to e6, which can be played by people who don't mind transposing back into the open Sicilian. I mean, if you're a dragon player or something like that, then pawn to e6 may not be a good gamble. After pawn to e6, a good line for white is to play knight g to e2. He reasons with this move that if he immediately fianchettos, then black will nonetheless not be prevented from playing pawn to d5. So he hopes to counteract black's pawn to d5 with other methods. So after knight g to e2, if black does play pawn to d5, which white has been unable to prevent, white will capture pawn takes d5, black pawn takes d5, and now white pawn to d4. The idea of this is to fix black's d5 pawn, make it into a weak and isolated person. Of course, black could answer pawn to d4 by moving pawn to c4, but then white would go ahead with pawn to king's knight 3, bishop to g2, and knight to f4, with great pressure against black's d5 pawn. Now, you'll reset some of those pieces just back to the position where white had played knight from g1 to e2. I mentioned that black often plays knight to c6 or pawn to a6 then. And then white can either continue with this close variation, g3, or go into an open line with pawn to d4. In the line after one white pawn to e4, black pawn c5, white knight c3, pawn to e6, knight from g1 to e2, black knight to c6, white goes pawn to g3, black may push ahead with pawn to d5, white pawn takes d5, black pawn takes d5. And now if white plays pawn to d4, black can himself put a lot of pressure on him by moving bishop to g4. A game between Fischer and Bartók in Zagreb 1970 went, instead of white playing pawn to d4, bishop to g2, black knight f6, now white pawn to d4, black pawn takes d4, white knight takes d4, black attacked the queen with bishop g4, white queen moved up to d3, black bishop e7, pawn to h3, bishop to e6. Not sure why that bishop had to go back there, but anyway it did. So white took it off. Knight takes e6, pawn takes e6. And after both sides castled, white seemed to have quite a good position with the two bishops and potential pressure against black's central pawns. So we can see in this variation that black does take responsibilities upon himself by playing the variation pawn to e6 to d5. Let's look at another example of this type of position. It's Larsen against Suetin from Copenhagen 1965. Once again we can see white putting pressure upon black's center, which black has created by playing pawn to d5. Please reset your position, your pieces in the start position at move 1, and we'll just look at that variation. Pawn to e4, black pawn c5, knight to c3, knight to c6. White now went into the close with pawn to g3, black knight to f6, white bishop g2, black pawn to e6, white knight from g1 to e2, black bishop e7, white castles, black castles, white pawn to d3. And now, instead of pawn to d6, which looks safer, black moved pawn to d5. And we got white capturing, pawn takes d5, black recapturing, e takes d5. And now comes the central pressure, bishop to g5. Black moved his threatened pawn with pawn to d4. White bishop takes f6. Black bishop takes f6. White knight to e4. This knight strikes both at the bishop at f6 and the pawn at c5, so the bishop moved back to e7. And white moved knight to f4, which looks quite a good position for him. He's got a lovely bishop on g2, and his knights have also got a lot of work to do. To illustrate further the ideas of the pawn to e6 variation, we shall look at a recent game between Basman and Rayner from the Lloyds Bank International 1978. This one began from the initial position with pawn to e4, pawn c5, white knight to c3, black pawn to e6. And now, instead of the recommended on this tape move, knight from g1 to e2, white chose pawn to g3, black pawn to d5, and white captured pawn takes on d5. Black e takes d5, white bishop to g2. This pawn to d5 variation of black's was one favoured by Korchnoi in his 1969 match against Spassky. He claimed he'd discovered the complete antidote to the Spassky system, and in fact Spassky didn't get much advantage against him in the games in this line. However, if we look at the position, white's game surely looks quite good, with his bishop on g2 striking down the open diagonal and through the center. Well, at this point black defended his d-pawn by moving knight to f6. White played pawn to d3. Doesn't go pawn to d4 because he would rather control white squares, so pawn to d3 is played. Perhaps had white already had his knight on e2, he might have gone pawn to d4, but he doesn't really want to play pawn to d4 and have to recapture with his queen. Now, white's plan is going to be similar to what we saw in the Larsen-Suetin game, which is to move his bishop to g5, and then say his knight to e2, and then to f4. Thus put more pressure on those central squares. Now, realizing he isn't going to be able to control d5 for long, Black therefore pushed on with pawn to d4, which gives him a spatial advantage. White moved his knight to e4, and black captured knight takes e4, white bishop takes e4. This bishop now occupies an even more beautiful outpost in the center of the board, striking against both wings. Black therefore tried to dislodge it by moving his knight from b8 to d7. It's going to go to f6. Maybe later he wants to put it on d5 and bolster it up with bishop to e6. So please switch off your tapes here and decide how you would answer this last threat of black's. Well, you naturally wouldn't like to play knight to f3 here for white, which cuts off your bishop's retreat after black knight to f6. Also, another line from diagram 25 would be for white to go knight to e2, and then we'd have black going knight f6, bishop g2, knight d5. And black seems to be developing normally, as he's able to then go bishop to e7 and castle. White therefore, from diagram 25, decided to try and reinforce his control of the central diagonal by moving queen to f3, a rather double-edged move. If you hadn't considered it, please switch off again and study its consequences. At first sight, it looks as though black can just continue as planned with knight to f6, since if white bishop takes b7, black answers queen to e7 check, and then when the bishop goes back to e4, bishop to b7 is crushing. But white can do better. After knight f6, from diagram 25, white can play bishop to g5. Then if black queen to a5 check to break the pin, he can move his king to f1. You'll now see in this line how important it is to retain the knight at g1 for a little while, otherwise black bishop to h3 check could be embarrassing. White king to f1 prepares to move rook to e1, and if black answers knight takes e4, then queen takes e4 check, bishop to e6, white queen takes b7 seems to gain a pawn. Well, so much for knight to f6. If you go back to diagram 25, adding white queen to f3, a second thought in this position is that black can gain time by attacking white's queen. He can go knight to e5. This works all right if white should retreat queen to g2. Then black has a good attack with pawn c4 and bishop to b4 check. But white should retreat his queen to e2, and black could find the position of his knight at e5 a little embarrassing due to the concealed pin. For example, if he goes bishop d6, white pawn to f4, or bishop e7, white bishop to f4. In view of these lines, black did not move his knight in reply to queen to f3, but played queen to c7, which threatens knight to f6 without having to face the pinned bishop to g5. Here, of course, white will gain little from going bishop to f4, because black will just go bishop d6. But he actually went bishop to g5, putting further pressure upon black's position. It's now time to leave this game if you wish to see the continuation of it, where white was able to retain his powerful bishop on e4, and thus the advantage. It can be found in the accompanying booklet. It's also time to end the survey of the Sicilian close variation, and I hope that it has shown you the possibilities inherent in white's rather passive-looking formation. It certainly is a most powerful addition to your opening repertoire. It brought Spassky the World Championship, so who knows what it will bring you.